You know, it's a big day for Humankind when they release this, a trailer alongside of their developers update. Today we heard about Humankind Games' first official expansion pack, the Together We Rule DLC. Here it is. We're watching the announcement trailer in the background in all of its glory, and of course there are a whole load of new features. Take a look at just how spicy some of these are, from new cultures to a Congress of Humankind, a global diplomatic feature, a resource currency denoted to diplomacy, and so much more. In this video, I'll be covering off the paid features for the new expansion pack, Together We Rule. There's a free update accompanying it as well. I may or may not get time to cover that in this video. I don't want to overload you too much. They also released a few screenshots, and eagle-eyed viewers may be able to look in here and see perhaps some new buildings, geographic features on the map, or even some new units. Some of these outfits are very distinct. My favorite one is probably coming up in the second screenshot. I'll let you find it and then make it very clear. But regardless, in this video, I will cover off all of the exciting new things coming to Humankind. The paid DLC expansion pack focused in on diplomacy, like I say, on geopolitics, but a whole load of other things around the edges. There are those fantastic kilts I was mentioning earlier. So without any further ado, sit back, relax. We're going to cover off the things that you really need to know, and what has been the most exciting day covering Humankind, I think, in my sort of 14 or 15 months of covering the game since before it released over a year ago. Do subscribe if you'd like to join for more Humankind content, and let's jump in and take a look at this Humankind content. My lord, it's an exciting day to be a Humankind fan. Agents, leverage, a Congress for Humankind, and a whole load of new cultures from around the world. Let's take a look. We'll start from the top and work our way through. First and foremost, agents, a new class of unit that can serve as both diplomat or hidden agents in Humankind. The information on these agents is available on Steam, but not in the trailer, it's important to note. Also, of course, available on the Games Together forums, the Amplitude forums. So, our agents, a new class of units that can serve as diplomats or hidden agents. Notice that's an or, not an and or. They can act on enemy cities or collect ... So we don't know much more beyond that. Of course, there are logical comparison points for all of these things, right? Civilization 6 seems like a logical one because it's a very similar game within the genre. 4X historical strategy, encompassing the explorations of humanity and all of our endeavors across history. Then, of course, we also have other Amplitude titles that we can compare and contrast to as well. The agents themselves are likely to play out like spies in Civilization 6, perhaps. We can use them aggressively as spies. Perhaps we're seeing things like gathering information, sabotaging enemy districts or units. The opportunities are endless there. But then, of course, also we have those less aggressive acts. You can act as a diplomat. This could provide things, again, reflecting on similar games, like diplomatic visibility or extra diplomatic points. Because, of course, in any diplomatic expansion or really in diplomacy in any strategy game, there has to be a way to gamify or quantify it. You have to, in some way, be able to leverage that diplomacy, those diplomatic points, and convert them into real-world use cases. The diplomat unit, for example, may be able to do that through things like gathering intel, extra vision, or these diplomatic points. Speaking of which, leverage, a new resource in Humankind coming in our first expansion pack that can be used for various diplomatic actions. That's all we get. But here, this is what I'm talking about. This is quantifying some of that more airy-fairy diplomatic stuff and bringing it down into the game so that we can actually utilize it as players. Sometimes in games like this, these systems can be clunky and difficult to use. I like the fact that it's called leverage, for example. I think that's a great name for it, but that's an aside. Overall, this will likely enable a lot of the new features in this update, in the free update, and perhaps in more to come. Not only, of course, for standard play, but also when we think about new cultures being added, affinity types, abilities, and mods, right? They're really, the limits here are endless. But overall, this leverage mechanic will likely enable, I imagine, the rest of the DLC to really flourish. It'll likely be potentially our points that we're spending in global geopolitical diplomatic actions at Congress. More on that in a minute. There's not really a lot else more to say about leverage, so I'll probably leave it here, but it's really important that you understand that it will be likely a resource. I'm imagining it will be on display just like the rest, so you'll be earning your gold, you'll be earning industry or production on cities, and you may very well also be generating leverage, perhaps through those agents or diplomats that we talked about earlier. Again, the sky is the limit here. Embassies, as you can see, are perhaps more of a grounding figure, a physical figure, potentially, to go alongside the agents. Embassies form stronger ties with other empires and access cooperative treaties, like mutual access to emblematic units is the word that's not included there on Steam, but is absolutely on the forums. This is a really neat one. So obviously when we think about embassies, we know that they already exist in games like Humankind. Civilization 6, you get that little pop-up when you meet someone. Would you like to accept my embassy? You click yes, one and done. See you later. You get to see where their capital is. And a couple of other smaller things as the game plays out. But here we have a very interesting blend where it's not only introducing embassies, which I assume will, as they hint at here, allow access to cooperative treaties with other players. I'm assuming this will build a little bit more on the game's existing system of treaties and grievances, which is great, but a little limited and a little bit basic. This will likely be adding a lot more detail into that. Also, of course, this will help us engage with other empires, important in a single player and potentially also a multiplayer setting. Now, the second part is perhaps more interesting. It suggests not a blending of cultures, but a borrowing, a sharedness to cultures, if they are well aligned, I'm assuming. Access to cooperative treaties, like mutual access to emblematic units, is the specific thing here that I'm talking about. So we may be able to establish an embassy, build up ties with a foreign power, and then build their emblematic units or gain access to them in some way. I'm assuming build, it could be trade, I don't know. But that is very exciting for a number of reasons. It will enable a much better level of cooperative play, I think. And with improvements that have been made to the AI over the last year, I think it's a little bit more capable of handling itself. And of course, in multiplayer, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end of the video, the world here really is your oyster. But overall, this seems like a good both diplomatic function to add to the game, but also potentially giving some teeth to the agents, to the diplomats, and to the overall leverage mechanic. Nice to see some interrelated things. Speaking of which, the next one, this fourth one coming up, is probably the one I'm most excited about. The Congress of Humankind. Vote on globally enacted laws and resolve conflicts through diplomatic pressure. Of course, here building on some of those systems that we've already discussed, potentially like leverage, agents, and embassies. Here we have Humankind's answer to I am the Senate. The Global Congress from Civilization 6, Stellaris, does a brilliant job with its system here as well. In fact, a much better job in my opinion. And now Humankind is throwing its hat in the ring and adding a global diplomacy, right? This geopolitical level of engagement with other leaders. I'm very excited about this. I think that not only will it help to add a new dimension to Humankind, but also potentially helps to spice up the mid to late game, an area that in really all 4X historical strategy is somewhat lagging relative to the perhaps slightly more exciting early game exploration. Here, as you can see, we're allowed to vote on globally enacted both laws and to resolve conflicts. So there's potentially a soft power element here in the globally enacted laws, right? The less sort of militaristic cultures may be a little more interested in that. And then we have the ability to resolve conflicts. Whether this is the world needs to step in to stop a big bad guy, or whether there are other ways to leverage powers like the sort of hot and cold war mechanics, hopefully both. Either way, this is an incredibly exciting thing. I would assume that the leverage mechanic, that new resource that we talked about earlier, will in some way play out with the Congress as well. Again, to refer to Civilization 6's Congress system, it uses a highly numeric system that is not necessarily all that intuitive to the player. Hopefully this one will be front-footed in a way that is, I think, actually slightly more basic is a good idea. We'll have to wait and see. Either way, this is going to add geopolitics to, I don't know what areas of the game, but you have to assume that it will start to become more impactful as we move through into the later game. My goodness, that's a beautiful wonder there, isn't it? Victoria Falls. So good. Speaking of new wonders and new content, of course, there's a whole load of new content coming with this expansion as well. The Together We Rule expansion. We have new cultures, a new affinity that they just kind of snuck in with the next announcement that I'm going to talk about, and new content. So let's jump in and talk now about the new cultures and affinity coming to humankind. So gameplay features to one side, although you could argue the new cultural affinity is perhaps more significant than a lot of the others, we have new cultures, of course, coming in this DLC pack. It's not just adding new gameplay features, but we're also getting cultures like we saw in the cultures of Latin America and the cultures of Africa DLCs that have already released. Here we hear about 6 new cultures that will share a new diplomatic affinity. So we have scientist cultures, we have industrialist cultures, we have those focused on earning money or farming food, and now we have diplomats. Here they are, the Sumerians in the ancient era, I'm assuming. Next we have Han in the classical. Moving through into the third era of Humankind game, we have the Bulgarians. Very interesting. As we slide through the medieval into the early modern, we have the Swiss. Very cool. They are slotting into a very interesting, perhaps one of the less powerful eras in humankind. Be interesting to see how a diplomatic affinity, ability, and culture will shape that up. Then moving through, we have those wonderful kilt-wielding units, I'm assuming the Scots in the industrial era. The industrial era, already a pretty hotly contested one in humankind. And last but not least, and outside of the Australians, perhaps a culture that is closest to home for me in little old New Zealand, we have the Singaporeans in the contemporary era. Singapore, of course, famous for being a relatively rare example of a modern city-state, a city that is also a country. It'll be very fascinating to see how from the Sumerians right the way through to the Singaporeans, these new cultures, all of which are noted as sharing the new diplomatic affinity ability, will shape up not just all of the features that are being added here, because of course you would imagine that these cultures that are based around diplomacy and having that diplomatic affinity ability would probably, forgive the pun, leverage off some of the other additions that are being added into this expansion pack. Now, if we take that one step further, we also know that a new affinity ability has the potential to completely shift with the meta of the game. It may lift up or push down existing cultures and existing cultural affinities. What we don't yet know is how this diplomatic affinity and culture will play out. As you may know, in Humankind, with all the various different cultures, they have that little ability up in the top left. You can see mine here as the Bantu. I have an expansionist ability. And this ability lets me capture enemy outposts for free. I can ransack them and then convert them into my own without having to pay anything extra. Whereas, of course, a normal empire would have to ransack and then re-establish an outpost in its place. I wonder what the diplomats will be able to do. Will it be embassies or leverage that they'll be able to leverage? Will it be their agents or unit classes that will have specific abilities that go even further than the agents? Will they be able to exert diplomatic pressure and generate leverage in the same way that cultural empires can use their ability to push their cultural influence across territories and generate influence? There are loads of different ways that this could be structured based off existing systems, and that's just me basing it off the existing ones. We'll be excited to hear more details. Of course, as I mentioned at the start, this DLC is releasing in fall 2022, which is Northern Hemisphere speak for autumn 2022. Which is then converted into spring 2022 if you are in the bottom half of the world. Basically, what I'm saying is that's this season. So we should expect to hear more information on all of this stuff very soon. However, of course, that's not it. There is but one more point added to the paid DLC, and then there's a free update coming with it Together We Rule as well. Again, a separate piece. Let's talk about the new content. And of course, to accompany our Scots, Sumerians, and everyone else in between, we're going to have some new content to go along. Here you see, it's fairly straightforward. Natural wonders, cultural wonders, and narrative events. So I won't dwell too much here on the detail, other than to say that, of course, we should probably expect these natural wonders and cultural wonders in particular to coincide with the theming of the pack. This is a Together We Rule diplomacy pack, where they're adding resources like leverage and focusing on diplomatic cultures with diplomatic affinity abilities. Therefore, it makes sense that we're probably going to see some wonders that are related to that. Maybe it's big Congress-like buildings in the contemporary era, in earlier eras, or perhaps even natural wonders that could have something to do with where people met, i.e. important geopolitical places in history, Likewise with the modern era buildings, I assume. And of course, we have new cultures: Swiss, Scots, Singaporeans. There's a lot of S's there. It was almost the S culture pack, but they put the Hans and the Bulgarians in. Oh well, a missed opportunity, and probably for the best. Either way, we should expect to see the cultural wonders probably align with this as well. Likewise, natural wonders, we should expect them to come from these countries. The narrative events also may have some extra flex, some extra muscle to them, potentially. Of course, because they'll have a lot more content to go off, right? Congress of Humankind surely has a whole load of events alongside of it. And that kind of brings to a conclusion, a natural conclusion, all of the things that we've learned about so far the Humankind Together We Rule expansion pack, the very first expansion pack for Humankind. However, as I said earlier, there is also an accompanying free update. I feel, and actually I'd really like, if you've listened to this point, I'd really like some feedback on this. Information overload if I kept going here? Probably, because it's a lot to unpack, so I will save it for a separate video. However, we should probably take a quick look at what it offers. It brings likely a lot of really important accompanying changes that were highlighted in their developer's diary leading forward what's next for next year in Humankind. Third-party reinforcements, a reworked stealth system, and improved independent people, hopefully giving them a little bit more lifeblood, and of course an expansion that is focused around ruling together and the other people in the game. Again, I'll likely unpack this in a separate video and over the coming weeks as more information is revealed, as you might have seen there at a little comment down the bottom. I'm going to play us out now as we came in to the trailer. Let's conclude, and I'll share my initial thoughts on Together We Rule. So, the Together We Rule Humankind expansion pack that was announced today, releasing very soon, this season in fact. The pack brings agents and diplomatic units, leverage, the currency of diplomacy. It brings embassies and the ability to bring forth new agreements, cultural alignments, the sharing of emblematic units. We also get a World Congress in Humankind, adding new important geopolitical features likely throughout, and especially as you move towards the later game, I imagine. And of course, new cultures, affinities, wonders, and I have no doubt, a brilliant soundtrack to go alongside. This is Humankind's first expansion pack, the Together We Rule DLC. If you enjoyed this video and you're keen to hear more about Humankind, I would encourage you to subscribe. I'm really looking forward to this DLC pack. I've been harping on about a Congress for a very long time, but also I think it should add really interesting things to the meta, to the culture balance, to multiplayer, and to the mid to late game of Humankind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.